Thank you for joining us this evening to discuss air quality monitoring in Toronto, Hamilton, and Ottawa. I would like to recognize that most of us are attending this webinar and more generally living in the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, the Mississauga of the Credit Nation, and the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I will begin with a short introduction of the consequences of air pollution. In Canada, the federal government spends approximately $114 billion per year on air pollution impacts. Air pollution is the first cause of death worldwide at 6.5 million deaths per year, which is more than malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS combined. Most of these deaths are in other countries where there are industries that we in Canada are benefiting from. We often forget the impacts of industrialization on our communities and even more on the communities around the world. When we think of our environmental impact and the challenges that come with it, there are no borders or city limits. Everything we do, from the transportation methods we choose to how our food is being brought into the city, has an impact here in Ottawa for Ottawa's residents, but also in areas where our air pollution is carried. The monitoring and hopefully improvement of our air here in Ottawa comes with amazing co-benefits: reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, restoring biodiversity, as well as improved health and equity. We have the technological solutions to poor air quality, and we can change the way things are. That is why Ecology Ottawa has chosen to dive into this air quality monitoring project. We want to encourage residents to see the relevance and get involved as citizen scientists. But we've essentially copied our friends at Environment Hamilton and Toronto Environmental Alliance. Heather and Lynda are here today to delve deep into what they've discovered through their own air quality monitoring projects in their cities, which is essentially what sparked the idea to do the same type of project here in Ottawa. So just a few housekeeping details before I pass the mic to Lynda. You are all currently muted. During the presentations from Heather and Lynda, I'd also ask that you turn your camera off to ensure everyone can hear the presentations clearly. At the end of both presentations, we'll open up to questions, and please turn your cameras back on if you can and if you want to, so we can all have a feeling of being in the same room with one another. If you have any questions or issues that could be addressed during the presentations, like we can't hear the speaker, stuff like that, you can put them in the chat. I'll be looking at those. But if you have questions that can be answered with a longer answer, please keep them for the end, where we'll have a Q&A session. If you are Francophone and would like to ask your questions in French, I can answer in French or translate to English for the other attendees. Lastly, I would like to point out that the webinar is being recorded so that we can send it to those that have RSVP'd but couldn't make it. So that's all for me. I will introduce Lynda. Lynda has a PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Waterloo. She has taught environmental planning and policy courses at many universities in Ontario and is currently teaching an environmental policy inquiry course at McMaster. She is the executive director of Environment Hamilton and has been championing local improvements to air quality in Hamilton through many different projects. Lynda, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to all of you, and I'm so excited that Ecology Ottawa is starting an air monitoring project in Ottawa. As you can well imagine, we've been focused on air quality issues in Hamilton for a long time for obvious reasons. Next slide, please.
Sorry. There you go.
That's okay. Oh, sorry. So just very quickly, so you understand what Environment Hamilton is all about. We do work very similar to Ecology Ottawa. We've been around for almost 20 years, and we have a very simple mandate, and that's to provide Hamiltonians with knowledge and skills that they need to be able to protect and enhance the environment around them. Next slide. A long time ago, 2003, I think we started this. We created a program to help people to get involved in visually observing, documenting, and reporting problems with emissions from our industrial core. And any of you who've been to Hamilton know that we have a very heavy industrial core dominated by the steel sector. And this just gives you a sense of where we started. We literally took panoramic shots of the industrial skyline, labeled the stacks, and provided people with the information that they needed so they would know who to report a problem to when they saw it. We found that was one of the biggest barriers. People just didn't know who to call. Next slide. This is the modern version of our stack watching. It's a fridge magnet that we hand out to people. And I've just included in this slide a shot of some of the kinds of problems that we see from our industrial core. Next slide. But we started to realize that people were not just interested in industrial air quality impacts. People were asking us lots of questions about, well, what is the air like in my neighborhood? And so like all great environmental organizations, we stole this idea from another organization, and that's a group called GASP. It's the Group Against Smog and Pollution, and they work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so they created this approach to air quality monitoring using bicycles, and that's really what got us excited about getting involved in recruiting volunteers. Next slide. And this is the equipment that we've been using to do that. And again, we got advice and direction from GASP in Pittsburgh. This is the monitor that they use. It's a Dylos fine air particulate monitor created by a company in California. So we use that in combination with a compact GPS data logger. And what happens is in the case of the bicycle air monitoring where we started, cyclists literally would strap the particulate monitor to the handlebars of their bike and run the GPS data logger at the same time. Next slide. And we have a mapping system that we were using, and this was created by a now graduated Ryerson student named Kevin Worthington. Kevin continues to work in the air quality field. He's down in California now. So he built this system that allowed us to upload the air quality data in combination with the GPS data so that people could actually look, and with color coding, they could see how particulate pollution levels vary depending on where they were as they moved through the city on their bikes. The next slide. And this visual just shows if you were looking rather than at an individual trip, the mapping system over time would continue to average out the readings that people were collecting for us. So we started to get a sense of where are there chronic problems with air particulate pollution in the city of Hamilton. And we found this was really powerful, helping people to be able to visualize something that you can't see. And that's really fine respirable particulate pollution. You can't see it with the naked eye, but it has pretty serious implications for human health. A fine respirable particulate, also referred to as PM 2.5, is now a confirmed cause of lung cancer in humans. Next slide. And so we've continued over the years to take that ability to engage community volunteers in collecting air quality data, and we've applied it to other projects. So we were really excited to have the opportunity to partner with Toronto Environmental Alliance in the project that we call INHALE. And INHALE stands for Initiative for Healthy Air in Local Economies. And we received a grant for the two organizations. And so basically on the Hamilton side, we worked in several neighborhoods. In this case, you see a picture of a group of happy residents down on Ottawa Street in Hamilton. And if you know Hamilton, you'll know that Ottawa Street is right on the edge of the industrial core. So we certainly, through that project, we focused on at least one neighborhood where we knew that there were issues because of proximity to heavy industry. At the same time, these residents were collecting data along Ottawa Street, which is a busier street. So certainly documenting information about how vehicular traffic was impacting on local air quality as well. But I love this shot because it really gives you a sense of who was getting involved. We have a mom with her baby in a stroller, so she strapped the monitor to the handlebars of the stroller. We have a cyclist in the group, someone with a dog, you know, so people of all walks of life were excited about getting involved in the project. And what we would do through INHALE was street level air quality audits, where we walked along and talked to people about the air quality measurements and how they changed as we moved through the neighborhood. Next slide. And this just gives you a sense of the kinds of issues that we would see as we went along. This is a street in that neighborhood. There's a bus in that picture, but it's certainly driving along and kicking up a whole lot of dust. That you often see this problem in the springtime when cities haven't had a chance to get out and sweep the streets and clean things up. But this is a pretty serious source of particulate pollutant that can impact on human health. So part of the project has really involved helping people to see that it's not just from tailpipes of vehicles or from industrial stacks that there are issues with pollution that can harm your health. Next slide. And here's another example. This is a classic one of what can happen when you have construction activities happening in your own neighborhood. In this case, it's a worker out actually right in front of my house in the east end of the city, cutting concrete with a concrete cutting saw, but not controlling the emissions. And so we would talk to people about that too, and the fact that simple controls like using a fine water mist can make a big difference in terms of controlling that kind of particulate pollution and preventing people from being exposed to it. Next slide. And then here's another example. In Hamilton's downtown core, we're seeing a lot of redevelopment happening. So construction demolition is also another problematic source of pollution. And again, something that can be easily controlled at construction sites through using fine water mists and those kinds of controls. Next slide. And then of course, Emily made reference to this at the start. We have a really challenging issue in Hamilton with industrial trucks cutting right through the core of the city. And so a big part of the work that we've done through the Inhale project and other efforts that continue today is to get conversations started with people about these kinds of impacts and what we can be doing to address them. And I'll speak a little bit more to what's happening right now on that front in Hamilton where those trucks are concerned. Next slide. And I've included a street sweeper, and this is a good quality street sweeper, and because I think as you're getting out there into the community, you'll start to hear more about simple things that can be done to control particulate pollution. So in Hamilton, we do have sweepers that are designed to sweep the streets and actually properly collect that really fine respirable particulate, and this can make a huge difference. So I guess our message is that as you get out into neighborhoods and you see problems with particulate pollution, in some cases there are pretty straightforward solutions that the municipality can take on that are going to make a big difference in terms of improving air quality. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. And then please never forget this. When you're talking about particulate pollution, trees are incredibly powerful. So this is a really interesting study that we found that shows that the leaves on trees can capture up to 50% of fine particulate pollution. So there's just an electron microscope close up to show you how those trees capture that particulate. So this is something that's become really important in what we talk about in Hamilton as far as solutions go. Next slide. And it inspired us to create another project. We call that Trees Please, Green Solutions to Air Pollution. So in this project that we're doing in partnership with Environment Hamilton and the Hamilton Field Naturalist Club, next slide. We're basically taking that air pollution data that we're collecting using our monitors and our GPS data loggers, so it's mobile data, and we're combining it with data that we're collecting by doing urban tree inventories. So through those inventories, we're essentially assessing the health of the trees that exist in neighborhoods in the city. And what we're doing is we're combining that data and identifying priority tree planting locations. We call that strategic tree planting. So basically, we really focus on neighborhood locations with high particulate pollution levels and poor urban forest health. And then we do work to try to get more trees planted in those areas. Next slide. So we're using a tool called Open Tree Map just to show you. And that is where we're inputting the data that we're collecting about the trees. Next slide. And we've had some luck too convincing politicians that more funding needs to be directed to tree planting as a way to help to mitigate the impacts of poor air quality. And so this is just an example of that where we were successful in getting some industrial fines that were levied against one of our local steel mills. The city ends up receiving that fine money, and it was directed to supporting purchasing and planting more trees in impacted neighborhoods where air quality is poorer, where there are problems. Next slide. And then another really great thing that's evolved out of this project is community tree plantings that we do in partnership with the municipality. So the city has agreed to work with us to identify locations where strategic tree planting can happen to improve air quality. And we've now been doing that. We're into our 4th year of these really great opportunities to try to make a difference through tree planting to improve local air quality. Next slide. We also have a project that we call Friendly Streets. And again, this has evolved out of our interest in air quality. This project focuses both on improving the urban streetscape for pedestrians of all abilities and for cyclists. And we've now integrated into that work an air monitoring component, because people who are out there on those walks and rides talk a lot about street safety, but also about exposure to pollution. So this has become a really important piece when we go and walk along the streets. We not only talk about bumpy sidewalk or wouldn't it be nice if there was a bench here, but we also have volunteers collecting air particulate data. Next slide. And that's led to a very active campaign that's happening right now. We have a petition out there. So if you've been to Hamilton, you may have noticed that in our downtown core, it's not an unusual thing to see massive industrial trucks like this one. And this shot really tells the story of how Hamilton's industrial past is clashing with how Hamilton is changing as a city right now. So these trucks regularly swoop into one of our main east-west cycling corridors. So there's a petition underway, and we're actively engaged in the city's truck route review process. And there's a growing number of people who are pushing to have those industrial trucks essentially banned from urban neighborhoods in the downtown core and required to use roadways that have been specifically designed in the industrial core to move those trucks in and out from the major highways like the Queen Elizabeth Way into the industrial core and back out. So wish us luck. It's proving to be a challenging battle, but we're really hoping to see some amazing improvements in the core. Next slide. I'm not going to get into detail on this, but I just wanted to make you also aware that one of the things that we have dabbled with a bit, and anyone who's interested in this, you may want to learn more. Out there in the world right now, there are lots of really affordable sensors, environmental sensors that you can access. So we have done work at Environment Hamilton where we've engaged community in teaching people how to build their own air particulate monitors. And we use what's called Arduino to do that. And some of you may be aware of Arduino. If you're not, please feel free to follow up with me after. I can share a detailed manual if you want to build your own monitor at home. Next slide. This is just a shot of the air particulate sensor that we've been using. Very accurate, a good way to, almost as good quality as the more expensive Dylos monitors that we've used. But you can purchase one of these for as little as $9 US. Next slide. And again, just very quickly, we've engaged kids in East Hamilton in an impacted neighborhood in building these monitors. Next slide. And then taking the monitors out for a trial run in their own neighborhood. So I just want to end by saying there are lots of exciting ways to get involved in monitoring air quality in your community. I hope that gives you a sense of some of what we've done in Hamilton. And I would just add that this is a really fantastic way. We're never going to replace government regulators, but it provides much more information. More people out there collecting data means it's more likely that problem areas are going to be identified. And I always say, we're red flagging these problems so that regulators can go in and take a closer look, and that we can all as communities work to address problems to make air quality healthier in every neighborhood in our cities. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Lynda. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. That gave me lots of great ideas for follow-up campaigns here in Ottawa. And Adrian just mentioned that they really liked the names of the campaigns that were quite clever.
We try to have fun with that just to grab people's attention as we go. Yep.
Yeah, nice work. So there is a question in the chat. I think we could come back to it in the Q&A so that Heather can also reply.
Great.
So I'll introduce Heather. Heather is the campaigns director at Toronto Environmental Alliance. She has an undergraduate degree in environmental science and a master's in adult education and community development. Heather has been fostering local leadership in Toronto, from local monitoring projects that turn residents into citizen scientists to civic actions that win environmental policies at Toronto City Hall. Heather, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great, so I guess I'll just get started. I really appreciate that Lynda shared some of the history of not just the Inhale project, but what came before it in Hamilton, and also where some of this inspiration for using citizen science to tackle pollution issues locally came from. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that there was a long history too of learning from Environment in Hamilton and collaborating on a previous project, which was called the Good Neighbors Campaign. And that was when we were really addressing industrial sources of pollution, specifically concerned around different kinds of toxic chemicals, including particulate matter. And that's when we really started working a lot together on air pollution issues. And I remember being at an environmental conference with Lynda many years ago at Hard House in Toronto, and we were lamenting the fact that even though we've had less smog days and there's less smog reporting, and you don't hear about air pollution on the news as much anymore in Canada, but especially in Ontario cities, we know the truth that there's still a lot of air pollution issues. They just aren't showing up on Environment Canada's monitoring system because they're very hyper-localized. The chemicals that people are being exposed to aren't necessarily being caught by those monitors. And there's really fine types of particulate matter that really impact people's health that are still even being studied by academic researchers today. So there's a lot that we wanted to do to make air pollution more visible to people, where the data that was being provided by other levels of government just wasn't known to people and also wasn't going deep enough to really engage folks. And there's a lot of disbelief out there of whether or not that monitoring that the government is doing is accurate. And I think breaking it down and getting it into the hands of individual people to go out and explore and be motivated by what they are most concerned about in their community really makes a big difference and does get people a lot more engaged in advocacy as well. And just to recognize, the Inhale project was funded by the Metcalf Foundation. And at the time, it was really with a local economy's perspective that they were interested in this, because we recognize that growth in our cities really can't be exponential growth the way it has been, that there's been a lot of inequity, there's been a lot of environmental injustice, and we have climate change and other health crises that we need to worry about. So Metcalf was interested in how we might use air pollution monitoring to encourage more local solutions, including advocacy and in projects at the local level, to really reinvent the concept of growth and do it in a more, and reinvent the concept of prosperity as well. So if you can go to the next slide. I just wanted to, I know this is very wordy, but I just wanted to share a little bit about our perspective on the Inhale project that we worked on. So we did this pilot project in 2 different areas of Toronto, South Etobicoke and downtown Toronto. And why we picked these areas: downtown Toronto is very well known for having a lot of air pollution, especially from transportation sources. There is actually a lot of lower income communities living in the downtown, but a lot of people who are implicated in creating the pollution downtown who don't live in that neighborhood. And in South Etobicoke, there is a mix of industry and it is a changing neighborhood, but they had also recently had a local air quality study done, which was purely based on modeling. So based on information that industry and other agencies were providing, they were looking at areas where there might be more air pollution concerns that were causing health issues. But there was a lot of community pushback, not necessarily knowing if this was up to date or if it was really relevant to their concerns. So we wanted to create an opportunity for people to get some monitoring into their own hands. It really attracted a wide range of participants. I think, Lynda's already showed some photos of exactly that, residents of all types, folks with young children, student volunteers and interns, very active people who were involved in cycling and walking communities, data nerds, people who are really, really interested in collecting data and wanted to see it mapped and wanted to kind of learn more about that. People who had respiratory health illnesses or concerns were motivated to be involved. People who had specific air pollution concerns in their area, like transportation emissions or construction project. And of course, we also saw a lot of range of residents of all ages and all types of people who lived in different kinds of buildings. So it wasn't just people who lived in single family homes. We had a lot of people from high-rise buildings, including condos, co-ops, and apartments as well. People might be wondering how we got people recruited. How did people get interested in joining as citizen scientists, especially as volunteers? A lot of it was word of mouth, promoting in people's e-newsletters, not just T's own newsletters, you know, targeting to people who lived in that area, but also community groups who had e-newsletters, and local events that we could set up a table with an air monitor and show a little bit more about why it's of interest. We also used a lot of promotional materials like posters, postcards that we handed out, buttons, t-shirts. We made a video. We had a project website that had both Hamilton and Toronto's information on it so people could sign up to volunteer. So we invested in quite a bit of infrastructure to promote getting people involved. And we also use local media, I think, to attract people to the project. As far as turning interest into activity, I wanted to just share a couple statistics of how much effort can go in for an organization. And so for folks who are listening in on this presentation who may be interested in getting involved, we called our citizen science volunteers community air trackers. We recognize citizen science it's a catchy term, but not everybody is a citizen, and that certainly did not stop people from being involved. It could be newcomers to Canada and still be involved. So we use the term community air trackers. In Toronto, we had 70 volunteers sign up in South Etobicoke. 21 of them actually followed through with getting training to learn how to use the equipment that Lynda was talking about. It wasn't the simplest to understand, so there were certain protocols they needed to follow. And then we ended up with 12 active participants who were regularly going out and doing monitoring. Or even things like a video. We had over 1,000 views of the video. We were trying to encourage people to help us buy more monitors. At the time, not those Arduinos that Lynda was talking about, but those Dylos monitors were very expensive, and our project funding didn't give us much funding to buy enough monitors, frankly. So we ended up raising $1,500 from 18 people who donated to that project. Can you go to the next slide? So I just wanted to give an example of a few ways we were collecting data. So for instance, our canvas up on the top picture here, our door-to-door canvas that we have, they actually took the air monitors out when we were in South Etobicoke because they were doing door-to-door engagement anyway. They brought the monitors with them a few times to show people what was going on in their community and get more people interested. And I think that was a really exciting way to reach people who weren't necessarily receiving the information through other channels. And on the bottom, you'll see some of our summer students one year who were actively involved in different neighborhoods using the air monitors to engage people in community events. Yeah, and then this was another example of even just doing some street monitoring, but again, with the t-shirts, with visibility, and they had postcards where they could hand out. So they got a lot of people walking on the street in their neighborhood asking questions about, what's that? What are you doing? And that was a great way for them as trained people involved in the project to strike up conversations about air quality and what people's concerns were and how they could get involved. So it was a really exciting way to engage a lot of new people that way. Next slide. We also, as I mentioned, got quite a bit of media, and so we really did try to focus on local media. And so here were a few examples where we got it to the target audiences we really wanted to be reading the stories. Next slide. Yeah, so as Lynda already shared, there were different ways people could collect air monitoring or air data with the monitors. That included walking, rolling, whether that was cycling, or people who have mobility devices that were using it with their scooter, their wheelchair. There were some stationary air monitoring that we did. The map that Lynda showed was less focused on stationary monitoring. It was really meant to be from point A to point B, how does your air quality compare and change over the course of your route? But stationary monitoring was an interesting thing to do at an event, or to do a comparison like at a open streets festival where it's completely shut down to car traffic one day, but the next day it's it's completely open to car traffic. So you have an opportunity to compare those 2 days or the hours before and after. And then certainly educational, you know, Lynda was showing some photos of students making monitors. We certainly loaned out our monitors to school groups and others who had very enthusiastic teachers who really wanted to instill an interest in science and air monitoring, as well as environmental justice concerns with their students. And this was a way for them to explore that. And of course, the kind of outreach and engagement and ways we use the air monitors really depended on the neighborhood. And so I wanted to just share a couple of those examples of how it can be different in different communities and the importance of being flexible. So in South Etobicoke, there's a bird sanctuary. So bird watching festivals and birders were great people to get involved in air monitoring in that community. Farmers markets are really popular. There's a community health center there that works exclusively with equity-seeking communities from the area who are concerned about their health. And so that was another great partnership we had to promote the air monitoring initiative. And in the downtown, a bit different. We did a Jane's Walk. We were part of that Open Streets Festival, and we even partnered with a business improvement area. So again, different approaches for different areas. Next slide. Oh yeah, so these are just a couple pictures as an example, but have to have a photo of a person with a dog, because I don't know, Lynda and I probably both found this, is that people who walk their dogs regularly were really great air monitoring people, because they usually had something to strap the air monitor to and were out, you know, 3 times a day. So they were very active participants. Next slide. These are just a couple screenshots from the YouTube video that you can find online if you're curious, but it profiled a few of those personal stories of what motivated individuals from South Etobicoke to get involved. And so here you'll see, you know, people who are a cycling community, a father who really wanted to engage his young kids in monitoring, and also really wanted to do more advocacy for safe cycling routes in the community and wanted to use the data for that purpose. And Tanya, who had a newborn baby who had some respiratory health issues early on in her life, and that really motivated Tanya to explore what might be causing my baby's health issues, and could the air pollution in our community be one of those reasons. So she was very motivated to put one of those air monitors on the baby stroller and get involved. Next slide. Oh, this is just an example of us at the Open Streets Festival. So we used our bike and we just pushed it around as with a little sign, and again, just attracted a lot of questions from people who really wanted to know a bit more about what we were doing. So you can almost treat it like a mobile lab, and it really can engage folks, because some of these air monitors, one of the advantages of the Dialos monitor was there's a display. So people could see in real time what the air monitor was catching as far as air pollution levels. And that was a really, I think, a highlight of using that device. There were a lot of challenges with that device, but that was one of the advantages, I'd say. And next slide. So Lynda already showed a picture of what the data maps, you know, could look like. And I just wanted to show a screenshot of this, because sometimes, you know, there were pros and cons of using the mapping and the data. And it was something that we needed to remind people, was that it's just a shot in time. You know, you're sampling for a day and then you're not sampling for 28 other days. So the data we'd put up on the map could tell a certain story that seemed really good or really bad about air quality in the community. But because we didn't have data every single day, the way a government-run air monitoring station does, you know, really was a snapshot in time. And so it has its limits, but it also has a lot of engagement potential, a lot of learning potential. And I think if you're focused on what you want to do and you're focused on the kind of data you want to collect and why, you can be really effective. I would say we learned that our geographic areas we were focusing on in Toronto were too big, which meant that our data was too spread out by too many different volunteers in different parts of the neighborhoods, which meant that we didn't have the rigor of having a lot of data for one particular location. So that was a learning for us. Next slide. So, you know, these are some photos. I think one is a Hamilton photo and one is a Toronto photo, but these were examples that we used to kind of look at key learnings. And transportation was certainly one of the biggest motivators for people getting involved in the project. They were concerned about air pollution, they were concerned about traffic and safe streets. And so this was certainly one that came up. And that screenshot in the top shows a gap in the cycling network in the South Etobicoke area. So there's a part of a bike lane and then it ends. I'm sure this happens in Ottawa too. And so this was an area that was of interest for some of the residents who were advocating for better cycling network. Next slide. And of course, construction. You already saw these photos. I stole them from the Hamilton pictures that we had in our stock. But construction was one of the biggest things that came up in Toronto as an area we weren't expecting. We were really focused on transportation at the time, and construction surprised a lot of active volunteers who said, wow, I was expecting transportation to be the worst, but it's such an ongoing source of air pollution that walking by a construction site really made the air monitor jump up in its air pollution readings. And so that really resonated with a lot of people and stood out to them. Next slide. I just wanted to say that, you know, some of the things we tried to do to turn the data into action was also to get people thinking about what kinds of solutions they'd want to see, and using the data collection and the maps as a way to prompt discussion, because really what we wanted to get to was the solutions. And so we even did a survey in South Etobicoke asking people how they think we could improve air quality in their community. Next slide. So I just wanted to share like a couple like last insights before I close. And one of them was, you know, how did we turn data into action? And so this is a little spotlight story that we shared with our funder when we were submitting our final report that I thought was kind of a nice example around green solutions. So I'll just read it out since it might be hard to read, but 2 of our active Inhale volunteers in the South Etobicoke area, Kent and Craig, were using their community networks to draw attention to how the air monitoring data they collected could inform decisions about where to put green infrastructure in their area. So kind of like the Trees Please initiative that, that Lynda was referring to. So in this case, Kent is an active member of a relatively new community organization in South Etobicoke, and he wanted to use this data to organize a tree planting this fall. And now there'll be an opportunity to kind of show the air monitoring data and maybe inform where they were going to plant the trees. So that was an example. Another one was a person who was a volunteer, lived in the neighborhood and worked for the local college, community college, Humber, that had a campus in the neighborhood. So they were engaging the campus in more sustainability initiatives, and they were going to partner with other community groups to develop a local urban food farm. So when they were thinking about sites for the community garden, they were thinking about what's a good site to pick that maybe is going to be least exposed to air pollution from the street or from other sources, so that the people working on this garden won't be as exposed to air pollution day to day, but also that hopefully the plants will be healthier and have less contaminants. So it's just an example of how they were hoping to use that data. And next slide, I think is my last slide. So how did T turn data into action? A couple examples. We certainly provided concerned residents with advice on how to mitigate risks and advocate for change. So mitigate risks might mean if they're doing walking with their baby in the stroller and they do some data collection, that might inform their choices about what time or where they check their routes or choose their routes, especially if they have the option and they're just going out for a leisurely stroll. They may not want to go on certain streets if they're worried about their baby's health, for instance. But also to advocate for changes like, you know, improving the bike lane in their community and that sort of thing. As I mentioned, we did a survey trying to turn the data into inspiring some action and getting people in the community more focused on what kinds of solutions they wanted to do. We used it to engage local city councillors on air quality concerns in their wards, including specific construction sites or specific industrial sites that were being flagged in our data. We used the Inhale Project's insights to tell really powerful stories about why people care and what needs to change. And these were really, really influential during policy debates and in media interviews. It gave us a lot more credibility, including the local residents, a lot more agency and credibility to say that they'd seen where air pollution is a problem, rather than just, you know, speculating. We also dug deeper into the issue of air pollution from construction sites because it was one we kept hearing about from folks. So we actually turned that into a new project. So much like the Trees Please project in Hamilton, we ended up getting funding for a secondary project specifically looking at developing resources to help people deal with construction site pollution. And those resources are accessible on our website, and people are still accessing them on a regular basis. And I think lastly, you know, we inspired educators and other organizations to try out the citizen science model of engagement. And I think testing it out and seeing how it can work for you is a really important part of learning to engage new audiences, come up with new techniques to really get people involved and give them the agency to be involved in advocating for change rather than it being just researchers or experts. I think anyone can become an expert when you have a little bit of confidence, and sometimes just a bit of collecting data was enough confidence for a community member to go out and organize in their neighborhood and push for solutions. So I think that's my last slide.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. That was a interesting perspective you provided on community engagement. I know I, for one, was never had access to science courses throughout my education. And so this for me, as well as you're saying, just gathering data is very interesting to me and makes me feel like I'm a scientist a little bit. So I imagine it's the same for others as well. So I'm just gonna stop screen sharing, and we've got some questions in the chat. So I'll just read them out here. So which tree species are better at absorbing fine particulate matter here in Ontario? In the UK, there was a detailed study on the pros and cons in absorbing various types of air pollution. Yeah, are there specific species in Canada that, that you both know of that you could suggest or recommend?
I can start. I'll be honest with you. I don't have a list of tree species that I'm going to rhyme off that I'm aware are better. Part of our challenge in Hamilton is we're certainly encouraging people to plant more trees, but we've made a commitment to encouraging people to plant native tree species. So we're hopeful that any tree with leaves is going to help, and we know that, you know, trees in full leaf will help, and we also know even, you know, coniferous trees are going to help with trapping air particulate pollution for sure. And then if you think about the fact that from a climate point of view, planting more trees is hugely beneficial on that front, that's something positive as well. So we haven't gone to the level in Hamilton of really focusing on specific tree species for their enhanced benefits in trapping the particulate, mainly because we've wanted to promote that commitment to ensuring that the trees that are being planted are native trees that are going to help with the local ecosystem.
If I could add, Lynda certainly knows more about the trees part. I would say our understanding of it at the time was that it's mostly about the roughage, like how much leaf cover, because the leaves are literally intercepting the particulate. It's settling on the leaves instead of blowing around in the air. And then when it rains, all of what's on the leaves, the dust that kind of settles on the leaves ends up being washed down, you know, down the tree and into the, you know, the grass or into the sewer system or whatever it may be. And so certainly planting new trees is important, but also preserving existing trees, because the older, bigger canopy, you know, trees are the ones that are probably doing the most work for air pollution right now, but we need to constantly plant new ones to invest in the future from that perspective. So I don't think it has much to do with the species.
Awesome. Jeff here is interested in a link to the Arduino particulate matter monitor. So Lynda, if you could put maybe your email address in the chat.
Sure. Yeah. And what I could do, Emily, is I'll also share, we do have a document. It's basically a manual that'll help you to build them. So maybe what I'll do is I'll email that to you as well, but I'm going to add my email address to the link. So anyone who's interested in that doc, feel free to send me an email. Sorry, I'm putting in the wrong address here. And I'll send that on to you.
Great, thank you. Graham is asking, the reliability of air quality sensors has seemed to depend heavily on the brand or technology used. What kind of comparison studies have been done to validate the data coming from these $9 sensors against scientifically accepted monitors like maybe the Dylos one? Has any of the sensor evaluations been compared to those from the Air Quality Sensor Performance Evaluation Center?
So I can start, and Heather may want to chime in. I know for those Shinye, the US $9 sensor that I showed, there are researchers out there who've put those little sensors through the paces, and that's how we know, for instance, that they're comparable to the $500 Dylos monitors that we have been using in our project. I do know that if you start looking, there are lots of resources available online to help you to know which sensors are reliable. There are groups, I know there's a group in California state that's regularly sharing information as new sensors become available. And I believe the US EPA also does a lot of work, at least hopefully they still do, where they're putting the new technology through its paces and sharing information with people about which sensors are the most reliable. So if you're heading down that pathway of contemplating purchasing one, there always is information out there. There are people assessing and sharing information on which sensors are the best to use on the reliability side.
Yeah, I can just add that, I mean, that was certainly a question for us, when we first started out, Lynda and I, and that's part of the reason why we started with the Dylos monitors at the time, was there was at least some comparable data, comparing the Dylos monitor to the more widely used scientific monitoring tools by governments. And Dylos monitors are $500 plus US and are quite limited and complicated to use. At the time, things like AirEgg were being piloted, and then there were studies saying that they weren't very accurate. And so at the time when we started this project, that we did quite a bit of looking into it to determine Dylos, but so much has changed. The technology's grown leaps and bounds, and as Lynda said, there's constantly new data coming out, new evaluations of which ones are most effective in that regard. But I guess my caveat to all of this is how it's important to get the best data you can, but also recognizing that we can't replace the role of regulators and scientists in collecting the kind of rigorous data that they will insist upon for policy changes at the big scale. But when we're talking about local changes, it's sometimes really about flagging an issue, as Lynda was saying, red flagging something, to say something's going on here that needs more attention, needs more resources. And sometimes that does prompt Environment Canada or the local ministry to do a bit more research and bring in their mobile air monitoring van that they have, which is extremely high tech and can get a lot more information than what our citizen science monitoring can do. But it can really flag that. And sometimes the solutions we are pushing for don't need super rigorous data. It's meant to support the argument for changes, and it's not the only reason. So for instance, a bike lane, the only reason isn't going to just be the air pollution. It's going to be a number of factors that will lead to the decision, but air monitoring can be one of them.
Tara is asking if there is interest in, or if there are initiatives to assess threats to healthy air that don't result from industrial or commercial transportation pollutants. I am thinking specifically about allergens from pollen, mold, etc.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and we have had there are people out there who point to that concern, and we've had that response to some of what we've been advocating when it comes to the tree planting. People who raise that concern about those kinds of sources and the impact that they can have. So we really haven't gone down that road in any detail. I know in Hamilton we have our hands more than full with the industrial sources and the vehicular emissions. Although I will say, and both Heather and I have pointed out in our presentations that with the work that we've done in both Hamilton and Toronto, it has highlighted other problematic sources like the construction sites, the road work, those kinds of activities. I know one of the things that really became highlighted in some of the walkabouts, urban walkabouts that we did in the Inhale project, was the fact that, you know, you can't smoke cigarettes inside a restaurant anymore, but all of those smokers congregated on the public streetscape are a concentrated source of particulate pollution. And certainly community members who were walking along with us noticed that and watched, you know, as the respirable particulate levels increased in levels on the monitor as we walked through. In fact, I can remember really well one of our volunteers who ended up in the middle of a group of smokers who were interested to know what she was doing. So she took the opportunity to explain to them, you know, this is what we're measuring. And as soon as we walked into the area where you are, the levels really went up. So you get interesting conversations and interactions starting as a result. So it is a really interesting way to highlight sources. Another one I would mention too is particulate from cooking. So if you think about barbecuing or you know, even cooking on a regular stove, there are sources of particulate pollution from that. So when you walk by some restaurants in an urban area, you'll see the levels increase as well. So it does really get people thinking about, what are all the different sources of air pollution and air particulate in an urban environment. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. You covered it really well, Lynda.
Great. Jake is asking, what measurable impacts have your projects had on the levels of air pollution in your respective cities?
Do you want to start, Heather, and I can add?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, sadly, I can't say we've had a measurable impact on air pollution, predominantly because, you know, there's so much ambient air pollution in the city. There's also pollution that comes from other places. Some of the pollution in Toronto actually comes from Hamilton or comes from Ohio or other parts of the Greater Toronto area. And so tackling air pollution at the scale of a city, to see those measurable changes would be pretty significant. But I mean, Lynda might have more specific examples where you've been doing some initiatives that are more localized, that maybe there has been some payoff immediately. I would say most of our interest in doing air monitoring was about long-term impact and long-term change, and recognizing the policies and the kinds of infrastructure that we were pushing for would take quite a bit of time to see those kinds of significant air pollution reductions, but were still really important to take forward. So I don't know, Lynda.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Heather has said. I think in Hamilton, we do have a few specific examples where maybe there were chronic issues with air particulate pollution. And I'll describe one for you just so you have a sense of how we know through monitoring over time that we've had an impact. Again, Hamilton, lots of heavy industry. We've got a huge presence of you know, the scrap industry, because a lot of that scrap metal is fed back into steelmaking. And so, you know, I can remember one specific example of a scrapyard where I can tell you that riding past on my bike, I think I got the highest particulate pollution reading that I had ever gotten on a Dialos monitor. I probably shouldn't have been cycling through there at that particular moment in time, but that certainly triggered an interest on our part to start to document and report to the Provincial Ministry of the Environment, the regulator, what we were seeing at that site. And I can tell you with certainty that going down to that site now, it's not that there aren't still particulate pollution problems, but the company was required to implement measures that it was supposed to anyway through its operating permit. And we don't see those sorts of levels of particulate pollution anymore. So the monitoring really helped, because I was able to go to the ministry, to a district supervisor, and to say, oh my gosh, you know, I got readings off the chart here. I can see it, but I can also confirm for you that there's lots of respirable particulate pollution in what I'm measuring, you know, on the public roadway beside this property. And that was enough to really start and to start to trigger the regulator to respond. So it can be really useful in that way with specific issues.
Heather, you spoke of media attention. Maybe Lynda, you have experience with this as well. Jake is wondering, how did you attract media attention?
It was easy with the air monitors because it was so visual. You know, reporters had never heard about it before. It was a new concept. It'll still be a new concept if you're doing that in Ottawa. But it was something visible that you could show people were doing something, which for media, especially if there's video or photography involved, you've probably all seen the videos where it's just somebody walking and talking with the reporter, and it's so boring. But that's, because a lot of the work we do is advocacy, and unless you're doing a protest or some sort of direct action thing, there's not a lot to videotape. The air monitor, you could create a moment, very easily for the reporter to really grasp what it was and get really excited, visibly excited to cover the story. And then there were always volunteers involved in the project that were willing to talk to the media too, because they were just, really invested in what they were doing. So it was pretty easy to attract media that way.
That's great.
Yep. We had the same experience in Hamilton. And in fact, I think, and Heather, I think you were in Hamilton that day when we launched the project. We did a walkabout in Hamilton just to launch the project in both cities. And we had a reporter who joined us for the walkabout, and they were, that for them, that was an exciting opportunity. So it was pretty easy to generate that interest.
Yeah, it's quite a bit harder now during COVID. We're obviously not asking people to, volunteers to get together and for journalists to come on board. So I guess photos will be what we'll be using, but it's definitely a little trickier. Yeah. So I think Robin is asking, would it help for air quality to get more people out of their cars as well as planting trees or alongside planting trees? Would it make a difference?
I could start with that one. You betcha. You betcha it would. So we do this project and we've focused, you've heard about what we've done in Hamilton with Trees Please. Our Friendly Streets project is probably more focused on that idea of making the streets better for walking and for cycling. And an integral part of that is having conversations with people about how important it is, if you can, to make that modal shift away from car dependency and choosing one of these other options. Because we know for sure that's the ideal. That's the ideal from eliminating the vehicular emissions problem. Also from a greenhouse gas emissions reduction point of view. I know in Hamilton, put industry aside because they're the major climate elephant in the room, but when we think about community contributions, transportation is the only sector right now in Hamilton where greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. So from a climate point of view as well, we know it's important that we encourage people to make that shift. So I would say absolutely, that one's key too, but we also love the idea of planting more trees. Yes,
I would add absolutely on the vehicles, getting more people onto public transit or active forms of transportation is so critical, especially as you see so many people driving in vehicles with just one person in the vehicle and not, maximizing that trip with, with other folks. And I think it can also make, for some people, they'll always be driving, but it might make them a bit more efficient with their trips, do multiple stops in one go rather than, constantly going in and out. And I mean, certainly we saw the types of vehicles made a big difference. So diesel, bigger emissions, bigger the vehicle, bigger emissions. I know, Emily, you were referring to the food transportation system and all the systems that, come in and out of Ottawa. And so certainly the freight system, whether it's the transport of everybody's Amazon packages, when a vehicle that's only got 3 packages in it, and all of these things are certainly affecting our air quality, as are all the ride hailing vehicles out there that are growing in number and are idling, waiting for somebody to pick up. So it's really critical not just to encourage more people to opt to not use a personal vehicle where possible, but also to regulate those fleets, taxi, ride hailing fleets, freight, related delivery systems, and people's and city owned vehicles. So if Ottawa doesn't already have a plan for how they're transitioning publicly owned vehicles, whether they're transit vehicles or the city's owned by law enforcement vehicles, police vehicles, all the different vehicles owned by the city into electric vehicles, then that's certainly another area that the city can do a lot more transitioning with their own dollars. And they can do that faster than probably regulations for private vehicles.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, for Ottawa, we're transitioning into, well, implementation of energy evolution. So a lot of new electric vehicles are being bought by the city, and there will be ways to implement the shift for individuals as well. So it'll be a part of our community emissions reduction going forward. So I am aware of the time. We're 2 minutes over. I just wanted to address Adrian's question at the end. I didn't have time to go through all of the questions, but Adrian is asking if there is an opportunity to get involved in the air quality monitoring in Ottawa, and absolutely. So I will put my email address in the chat. Please reach out to get involved. We've got a team of, I would say, 70, 80 volunteers that are signed up, trained, and ready to go with the monitors. We've just received more monitors yesterday, so we're all set up to launch once and for all. We've kind of soft launched 3 or 4 times. So now we're ready to go. Everything's working. So please reach out if you're interested in getting involved. We'd love your help. Great. So thank you, Heather and Lynda, for your availability this evening and your great insights. It has definitely made me more excited about the impacts of our campaign here in Ottawa. And I know a lot of people on the call are volunteers or are involved in other ways. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I will be sending out the recording of this to everyone on the call.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for the opportunity.
And good luck.
Have a great
It's
evening.
gonna be great.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Take care.
Have a great night,
Bye.
everyone.